Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I am so excited to be back here on our live events to discuss an awesome topic this morning about multilingualism or bilingualism, so multiple languages in the home. And I have such an exciting guest to share with you guys this morning. But before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which I am from, the Darug people here in the nation of Australia, and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and future as they hold the memories, the traditions, and the customs and culture of the Aboriginal and the Torres Strait Islander people here in Australia. Now, you guys know, at the end of every month, we invite a special expert guest to discuss some work and some really important topics that you guys have let us know that you are interested in. And thank you all for taking the time to be here and really learning about all of these different topics that we have. So these events are all free of charge and they're streamed live again through our YouTube, Facebook group, Facebook channel, and also from Instagram. You guys can link up with us. So if you are listening, please let us know where you're from in the comments. I will give you a shout out. Let us know what country you're listening in from, because we always love to see our international guests streaming live from across the world. If there is anything you really need to know, the Guide and Grow Village, we've just launched that. It is an entire community of amazing resources and events just like this one. You can also get your 14-day trial live as well, so you can benefit from that. So today we're going to be discussing the topic of multilingualism and households that have multiple languages. So how to really navigate that. I know myself, I grew up in a multilingual home. So my background is Armenian, but I was born in Sydney, raised in Dubai, and then moved back here for high school. So there was multiple languages that I was hearing from not only my own household, which would have been Armenian, English, but French at school as well. So it was a really tricky, and I know that our special guest and I were discussing this before we jumped on. We're going to jump on. So it's going to be an incredible discussion, I know. Hello from New Zealand, my neighbors. If anybody else is tuning in from somewhere else, let us know. Just comment below. All right, so I want to introduce to you all, and I'm going to bring Gabrielle onto the screen and read a little bio. Hi, Gabrielle.
Hi.
I'm just going to read a quick bio of Gabrielle. So Gabrielle is an AMI 3 to 6 Montessori guide, and she's a certified TESOL instructor with a Master of Science in Child Studies. She's taught in New York City, London, Italy, and Austin, Texas. Her primary area of interest and study is language acquisition in young children, particularly multiple language acquisition. She speaks English, Italian, French, and a bit of Spanish. Gabrielle has a podcast and conducts workshops and consults to parents and educators that support and teach bilingualism and multilingual children. So welcome, Gabrielle.
Thank you, Sylvia. I'm so excited for our conversation. Thanks for having me.
That's all right. For everyone who is listening out there, or if you are watching the replay, #replay when you do, and let us know where you're tuning in from. We're always happy to give you a shout out. And also, if you have any comments or questions along the way, please feel free to type them up. We will pop them on the screen and we will take your questions live in action. That way you can really understand and learn a little bit more about things. And that might kind of be tailored to your specific situation at home, because that could be completely different to somebody else's. So before we dive into this amazing session and topic, tell us, Gabrielle, how did you become passionate about multilingualism or multi-language development in children, and what led you on this whole journey?
Yeah, so I grew up in New York City, and I did not grow up bilingual myself. I grew up in the neighborhood of Little Italy. My mom's family was Italian. My dad's family was American. My mom didn't grow up speaking Italian, so I only had English as my language when I was growing up, but I was always interested in languages. So when I got to college, I had the opportunity to start studying Italian. I had studied French and a bit of Spanish in middle and high school, but didn't really become conversational in either language. I studied Italian in college, and I then studied teaching English as a second language, and I got my TESOL certification. And after that, I taught English in Sicily. So I had the opportunity to really use Italian every day, and also be really immersed in the idea of language learning, both me, speaking Italian and also teaching English to my students when I was there. So after that experience, I became interested in Montessori education, and I got my Montessori training in London. Shout out to the Maria Montessori Institute, a wonderful training center in London. And so I became really immersed in Montessori, but I still had that passion for languages, and language development was always in the back of my mind. So then in my work as a Montessori guide for the next few years, I really loved observing the children in my class as they learned, their first language. The 2.5 and 3-year-olds came in, were still learning English, but I also had children who would be learning their second or third language in the classroom. And I would study them, and, we do a lot of observation as Montessori guides. And I was just always fascinated by how quickly children were able to learn languages. And I was always searching for that crossover between Montessori and multiple language acquisition. And then in 2020, I noticed that there just weren't many resources for families out there who are interested in learning about multilingualism from a Montessori approach. So I started Multilingual Montessori kind of on a whim one day in the summer of 2020, when we were, kind of in quarantine lockdown, and it just went from there. And now I do consultations with families who are interested in multilingualism from a Montessori perspective. And I have a podcast where I interview parents and educators and experts about their own language journeys and their professional work. And that's how it came about.
Yes, and I'm super excited to be one of those people. Coming up in March, I will be on your podcast, so I'm excited to have that conversation with you. Yeah. And it's so interesting how you particularly didn't come from a bilingual background or a multilingual home, and then you found your passion. I find that so amazing, because you just came to love, languages and language acquisition, and then, deep dived into it. I think that's so awesome. So tell me, what are some of the challenges that parents face, do you think, when it comes to multilingualism?
I think one of the biggest challenges is, there's a lot of misinformation out there. Parents often will ask me, won't bilingualism cause language delays, which is a really common misconception, or what's the right way to do this? What's the wrong way? And there isn't a right way, and there isn't a wrong way. So I think kind of knowing what approach to take is a big challenge. And also not getting discouraged by the naysayers. I hear from a lot of people who are like, my partner and I are really gung-ho about the bilingualism, but our extended family doesn't think it's a great idea. How do we navigate that situation? So I think particularly in the US, we're just not very multilingual. In Europe, it's a different story. Everyone, not everyone, but so many people speak multiple languages in Europe, whereas in the United States, it really is it's a growing area of interest. I think there are a lot of people who are interested in it and want bilingual education programs and want better second language education, foreign language education in our schools, but it's not as much a part of the culture here. So I think the families who really want it often go up against some resistance, whether it's from their school system, whether it's from their child's doctor, whether it's from their family members. And that's a challenge I hear a lot.
Yeah, the big one that I hear a lot is the cause of delay in language. And a lot of parents are quite challenged by that, and they get worried because their child might not be, speaking as much as somebody else's, and there's always these comparatives between their child and someone else's child. But I think that that's one area, if you could comment a little bit more about that. I know that there are so many people listening that have that concern. So what can you say to them to kind of let them feel a little bit more comfortable about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I will tell you that the research does not support at all that bilingualism causes language delays. So that I hope reassures families. And also, when we think about not falling into the comparison trap, that's something that we talk about a lot in Montessori in general, not just with languages. We talk about every child is, on their own path of development and following their own pace. So I like to remind families to try to approach it from that angle as well, and not compare even two children in the same household, in the same family. So as far as looking at a bilingual child's language development, what we know is that the research shows that monolingual children's language development is very closely correlated to bilingual children's language development. But when you're looking at the words that a bilingual child speaks, you have to look at all of their words in all of their languages. So, for example, say a monolingual English speaking 18-month-old might say about 50 words. A bilingual English Spanish 18-month-old might say 20 words in English and 30 words in Spanish, approximately. So if we compare that bilingual child's 20 words in English to the monolingual child's 50 words in English, of course, it's going to seem like the bilingual child is behind. They're not speaking as much English as the monolingual peer, but they're actually right on track, and these numbers are just generalized, but you really have to look at all of the words in both languages, and you have to see their vocabulary spread across all of their interactions. I also hear from speech therapists that you can count signs. If they sign for more, that also counts as another word in addition to the word for more in English, for example. So yes, the research does not show that bilingualism causes language delays. Of course, it's different, saying that from research and saying emotionally, really, it's fine believing it. But I'm really hoping that by hearing it again and again, people will be reassured that it's
and I mean, we know from, like, if you're looking at it from a Montessori point of view, and I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later on, but when you're talking about the absorbent mind and this period of time being the time where children really are absorbing, and they are like a sponge, and everything that they're hearing and seeing and feeling and touching, everything's being absorbed. So it's like, if you think about languages just on its own, like, that's just more and more things to take in. And it might just take that little bit longer then to come out. It's not that it's not being registered or that the words aren't there, but sometimes maybe just that connection takes a little bit longer. But isn't this the perfect time for them to be learning languages?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, having the opportunity to learn more than one language in the absorbent mind period of development is really, it's such a gift that we can give children. I think one of the reasons, like you said before, it's interesting that I grew up with one language and I'm so interested in multilingualism. I think that's one of the reasons I always was, envious of people who had grown up with multiple languages, because I can learn another language as an adult, and I have learned another language as an adult, but I will never be fluent as a native speaker. I'll never sound like a native speaker in another language. So the absorbent mind is really the time to give the child as much input as we can, as much language interactions, as much exposure to conversations, to the sounds of a language, because that really is what is going to take them into fluency when they're older. That's not to say that if your child is older than 6 when the absorbent mind fades, that you've lost time. But if your child is still in that absorbent mind phase 0 to 6, now's the time.
Yeah, it's absolutely a lot easier for them. I mean, I know my nieces, I just came back from Egypt and I visited my nieces, 4.5 and 6, almost 7. And they speak Arabic, English, and French. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, it's so impressive to see such a young child, just babbling and talking in 2 different languages, sometimes mixed. We've got the mixed sentences as well and the half English. And I think I learned some things myself, but definitely when we talk about children and their absorbent mind, it's such a pivotal time. It's such an amazing time for them to be picking up. And it's incredible when you see it in action. And I just love it myself. So it's never too late. Like, it is not too late, even if they are over 6. Like you said, Gabrielle, it's something that it just will take, it might take a little bit longer, or it might take, that extra time, but it's never too late to introduce.
Yeah.
But do you have any advice for introducing language if it is a little bit later on? Is there, I mean, you spoke about initially about there not being a one style approach. Do you want to talk to us about maybe the different approaches that you can have towards language acquisition at home, and maybe give our listeners some input about that? And if anyone's listening, if you have questions, please feel free to type them up.
Yeah. Okay. First, let me address your question about if your child is older, some
Oh, yeah.
different approaches. So one thing that I tell parents is that, like you said, it is never too late, but the approach does different. The strategy does differ a little bit if your child is older. So for a child who has that absorbent mind under the age of 6, what they really need is conversations and interactive language experiences to make the language be real. Of course, it's if parents choose to offer screen time in a language, I've heard one strategy families do is they'll offer screen time only in the language that they're trying to teach their child as a second or third language. So that's a great strategy. But what we really want to offer the young child is ways for the language to come alive in conversations and interactive experiences. Children who are older than 6 still need those interactive experiences, but they have what we call a reasoning mind. And the reasoning mind can think about learning, and it needs more direct teaching. So older children might benefit more from things like flashcards and language learning games, language learning activities, even a class, whereas younger children really need those immersive experiences and they don't necessarily need direct teaching. So that's one thing that I tell families. Of course, we always want to be working towards conversation as the gold standard for language learning. But just like adults, older children will need that direct teaching and talking about things like grammar and vocabulary. So let's talk a little bit about the different strategies that parents might use if they're introducing a second language or third language at home. So there's different approaches to multilingualism, and the right one for your family, it might not be the right one for somebody else's family. So the approaches really are not a one size fits all thing. And it's also not something that's set in stone. If you kind of go down one road and find that it's not working for your family, you can switch the approach. So I like to remind parents to be flexible and not feel like they're locking themselves into one method if they choose, say one parent, one language, and then decide it's not working. So common methods for raising bilingual children, and all of these will also apply to multilingualism, but let's give the examples for bilingualism. So you might have one parent who speaks English and one parent who speaks Spanish, and then you might use the one parent, one language method, in which the English-speaking parent speaks in English to their child, the Spanish-speaking parent speaks only in Spanish to their child, but maybe their language that they speak as a family or the parents speak to each other is English because the other parent doesn't speak Spanish. That's called OPAL, or one parent, one language, or one person, one language. Another strategy is minority language at home. So when we talk about the majority and the minority language is the language that's spoken by the wider community. So here in the US, that would be English in most places. So the minority language is whatever other language the family is teaching or speaking. So with minority language at home, maybe both parents speak Spanish, and maybe one parent is not a native Spanish speaker, but they're still challenging themselves to only speak Spanish at home. I've worked with families like that, which is always exciting when the parent is, motivated to try to speak their non-native language. That's not an easy feat. So minority language at home is when you only speak the language that's not the language of the community at home. So both parents in this hypothetical scenario would be speaking Spanish to their child, to each other all the time, within their family, whether they're at home, maybe also when they're outside, but they would speak English to the wider community, to people who don't speak Spanish. So that's another example. I also forgot to say, with one parent, one language, you might have a parent who speaks French, a parent who speaks Spanish, and then they each speak in those languages to their child, but outside the home, they speak in English altogether. That's another variation. And another method that's very flexible or adaptable to each family is called domains of use, or the time and place method. So this might be, for example, this family who speaks French and Spanish. If both parents speak both languages, they might choose to speak English outside of their home, and then they might choose when to speak Spanish and French to kind of give a little structure to their days. They might speak Spanish at home during the week, or French at home on the weekends and on vacation, or they might speak French at meal times and Spanish at other times. So that's, I mean, it can be very flexible, and it's really just to give you some structure if you want to kind of delineate, because it's hard to just say, oh, we'll speak Spanish and French. Sometimes, it's easier if you say, let's start out by speaking French at every mealtime, and we'll speak Spanish otherwise, and we'll speak English outside. And then that can always change, but that helps give a little structure to it. And those are the main ones. There's some other variations on them, but I hope that gives a good starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely food for thought. And it is really difficult. You say that you're going to be doing this, this, and this. And then, over time, I know that sometimes you just slip back into, English or whatever's most comfortable for you. So we've had some commentary. So I do want to put up a few comments from some of our listeners out there. So Paula says, I live in Malta and we're very much bilingual. One language tends to always become more dominant depending on very early years. I personally feel it's played a big factor in my development, being born in a bilingual country, both in languages, but also in other areas, since your mind always learns how to change so quick.
Oh, I love that. I just read such an interesting book that is coming out in April. It's called The Power of Language. I
Oh, yeah.
believe the author's name is Viorica Marianne, and she talked a lot about bilingual and multilingual people's development in areas outside language development, and also as far as empathy. That's a big one that I talk to families about. It's not just that your brain is able to do things a little bit differently and maybe quicker than a monolingual person's, but also um, people who speak another language, I think, even if they don't speak it as a native speaker, really have an empathy and a compassion for other people who are not the same as them. And I think that's such a gift to give to children. Just the idea that not everyone speaks the same language, not everyone has the same life experience, and having that worldview is great. So that's what that comment made me think of.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got another one here from Shilpi. In my home, everyone talks different languages. So when two people are talking to my boy of 11 months at the same time, they talk in different languages. Does that help him? And I was actually going to ask you that question. So if one parent is talking one language and they don't speak the same language as the other parent, and the other parent is talking a different language to that child, so like the same instance for this, the person's asking, like, does it help them?
Yeah. And so in this instance, in your example, that sounds like one parent, one language, and then the child would come to associate, you know, mom with one language and dad with another language, and maybe an aunt with a third language. I wasn't sure if this commenter was asking if the same person is speaking a different language. And if that is the case, or for anyone else interested, it's also, totally fine for one person to speak in two different languages to a child. But in that case, I would say try not to mix them. Mixing languages is, of course, something that bilingual people do. And, I tell families that you're modeling bilingualism. So you don't have to feel like it has to be very strict, like, oh, I can only speak Spanish now and I can only speak French now. But it helps, especially when a child is first learning a language, to not mix words within a sentence. As a habit, it's okay if you do it sometimes. I hope that answers the question.
And if it doesn't, Shilpi, just let us know and we can always put up another comment. All right. So we have another one from Samantha, but she said that we were onto it anyway. This was during our conversation when we were talking about conversational bilingualism. She said, on the lines of conversation, what are some strategies for a household with one bilingual parent? So if the conversation is lacking for the child to learn from. And then she did write another comment saying, oh, perfect, you're onto it. So I'm not sure, Samantha, if there was something that you wanted us to clarify or you wanted to ask Gabrielle again, Gabrielle, if you had another comment on that.
Yes, I do have another comment on that. So one thing I wanted to mention before and forgot is that experts recommend that children spend at least 30% of their time in a language in order to become fluent in it. So this is not a hard and fast rule, but I think it's something that's helpful to keep in mind. So, you know, that all that to say that it doesn't have to be 30% from birth. Some families choose to front load the minority language. So even if both parents do speak, let's say, Arabic and English, if they're in an English speaking country, they might only speak Arabic to their child, and then their child starts school and they get more English input. But if you're one parent who's bilingual and you want your child to speak both languages and you're the source of both of those languages, then you might think, in terms of that percentage in a vague way, have they spent 30% of their week, let's say, in one language? And another thing I would say is that utilizing outside resources is really the key, I think, to taking some of the burden of being the only language source off of a parent. So I think that can become a little stressful if a parent is the only person that their child has to speak to in that language. Maybe they don't live near their extended family, so they see their extended family a couple times a year and they talk to them on FaceTime. But it's really useful to try to find other sources of the language as your child gets older. You might find a play group of other parents. Facebook is really great for connecting to parents who speak the same language as you in an area, or you might find a virtual play group if you can't find anybody nearby. And having those other people in your circle who speak that other language, I think that's a great way to diversify the interactions that your child has.
I think that's a really important point when you were saying about just to take off the burden from you, because I feel like a lot of parents, especially when we feel like we're the only one with that specific language, we have to, be the ones to teach, and we have to. And then once we slip, we think, oh my gosh, we haven't given our child that opportunity, and it was because of us that they didn't learn it. And and I think relying on those external sources, like we do with anything in our parenting, we always need support. We always need that community. We need something to help us along the way. So I think that's a really important point when you talk about utilizing external resources, because a lot of the time we don't think about that when it comes to languages. We think, oh, this is my native language, I need to teach it to my child. Yeah. Whereas actually it's more of if you take on a community approach, that will take off some of that pressure from you, and it will become more enjoyable instead of being like a task. Yeah. My duty is to teach my child this language.
Yeah. And another thing is that it doesn't have to be perfect. I think that a lot of people feel like, well, if I can't do this perfectly, if I can't give them the perfect language input, then it's not worth it. It's too stressful. Let's not do it. And especially when we're talking about the absorbent mind, when children are exposed to that language, even if they don't speak it regularly, even if once they start school, maybe they're not using it, or maybe they understand everything their parent says in a minority language, but they only answer in the majority language. I hear that one a lot, and that's okay. The child still has that language in their brain. They still have that ear that they're developing for it. If they choose to study it as an adult or as an older child, they'll learn it more easily. If
Yes.
as a family you travel to a country where that language is spoken and they're immersed in it, you might be very surprised that they'll start speaking it and you didn't even know that they could speak it. So I like to remind families that, perfection is not the goal, that any input is very useful and
Yeah.
worthwhile.
This is a great question from somebody on Facebook participating from Milan, Italy. Hello. One place I've always wanted to travel to. Our son, almost 3, speaks Italian, Mandarin, and a little bit of English. We're planning to send him to a German school in the fall. Would it be too much? Our other family members keep telling us that adding a 4th language is too much for our little son.
Oh, I love that question. I hear that one a lot as well. How many languages can a child learn? So, back to that idea of 30%, you can't have, with 4 languages, you can't have 30% of the time maybe in each language because that adds up to more than 100%. But that's okay. I think it's important to consider who is the source of these languages, and what interactive language experiences can your child have. So, they'll be getting German at school. Wonderful. You don't have to worry about German at home. And Italian is the community language. So depending on what the parents' languages are, you might choose to focus mostly on Mandarin and English within the home, or maybe English is spoken by a nanny or a babysitter. So think about what are the languages that kind of need the most support in that situation. So I would say that in this scenario, Mandarin and English are the languages to think about providing the most input if you're able to do that at home, whereas German and Italian, it sounds like this child would be getting from the wider community.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Gabrielle. Joni, we're planning the Opal approach. We live in Australia. My husband's native language is English and mine is Flemish, so Dutch. I'm also fluent, not native in French. Is there any way I can teach both Flemish and French to our little boy, or would that be too confusing?
No, I think that's wonderful. Absolutely. I think in this scenario, domains of use or the time and place method might be helpful because that might help you think about or just give some structure to yourself about when you want to speak Flemish and when you want to speak French. And I also like to remind parents that you can, tell your child that you're still learning. That Joni's fluent in French, but somebody who maybe is learning French might say, I'm still practicing. Oh, whoops, I think I said the wrong word. That's okay. You don't have to be the perfect language source. So if you're learning alongside your child, that's also great. And you can talk about what that looks like to learn a language. But for Joni, I would say, think about times that you want to speak Flemish and French, or places, or situations, so that you can give a little predictability to it, both for yourself and for your child.
Yeah, I think that would make it a lot easier. And Gabrielle, for everyone listening out there, can you give us some examples of what an interactive language activity would look like?
Yeah. So it's really conversations. Anytime that at conversations, and for children who are reading and writing, it would be like writing to someone, like writing a letter can also count as an interactive language experience. But for a young child, we're talking about that conversational exchange. So one person says one thing and one person answers, even if it's a gesture or a facial
Right.
expression, as opposed to listening to music or listening to a story. Reading a book counts, if it's a person to person, but if it's like listening to an audiobook, that's
Right.
more of a passive language experience. Watching a
Okay.
TV show. So it's not to say that these aren't useful and valid tools, but things like conversations and games where you're interacting with another person, that's really what we want to prioritize.
So, could you, thinking about Montessori, when you were talking about interactive language activities, I was actually thinking about having, like animals, and then having cards that are in a specific language, and then every time the child would match it, you would maybe say the word in that language. Would you use English and the second language? Like if you were saying, teaching them about animals, and then you had a few African animals, would you say the word in both, or would you just say it in one language?
Yeah, you can do either depending on what the family's approach is and what stage the child is in their language learning. So if the child is learning a second language and is already fluent in their first language, as opposed to learning both at the same time, then you might use their first language and then introduce the term in their second language. If you're teaching your child two languages at the same time, like maybe doing one parent, one language, you can have the same activity, but with different, cards or different vocabulary. And one parent gives it in one language and one parent gives it in the other language.
Okay.
And another technique that is useful that I this is something that probably most families are doing anyway, but it's called the sandwich technique. And I like to recommend that parents use it when they're um, introducing or speaking a language that the child is not as strong in. So, what you do is you sandwich the new phrase or the new word in between the language that the child already knows. So, you might say the phrase, say, English is the second language that they're learning. You might say, let's go to the library today. And then you would say the word library in the language that they speak more strongly, their first language. And then you would say the phrase again, let's go to the library today. And so that you're not translating the whole phrase, but you're translating that one word that you are introducing as a new word.
I love that technique. I think that's brilliant. What a great piece of advice that one is. Caroline was asking, what do you recommend for parents that only speak one language, English, and want to teach bilingualism to their child at home? We don't want to have the wrong pronunciations while teaching.
Yes. Oh, I love that. And um, that's a question that I get a lot about how can I teach my child a language that I am not fluent in? And I tell parents to learn alongside their child. So, you can be very honest with your child that you're still learning too, and you really can utilize outside resources together. So maybe that means finding a play group where people speak the language you're trying to learn. Maybe it means getting an audio book recording and looking at the picture book at the same time and listening to it together so that you're
Oh,
listening
great
to that
idea.
like native accent, but you're there together and you're talking about it together. And then you can set a timer, get a sand timer. Children love sand timers. So get a 5 or 10 minute sand timer and say, let's try to speak in Arabic for the length of this timer. And then even if you don't make it the whole time, it becomes a game. So but to answer the question about not giving the wrong pronunciation, I would say try to find other sources of the language so you're not the only person who's giving the language input, which might be a class you take together, a music class you go to, anything you can find in the target language while you're continuing to speak that language, even if you're not the native speaker.
Great. And Caroline was saying the explanation about using one or both and sandwiching really helps to know how to read my multilingual books better. I think that was a great
Good.
comment as well. All right. So we've got one from Emily. She says, I'm currently in school working on a Bachelor of German. I'll be starting my third language class next semester. I can read German very well, but I'm not very comfortable speaking. My son is almost 4 months old and I really want to teach him German. Do you have any tips for me to strengthen my speaking skills while also trying to introduce the language to him?
Ah, that's such a great question. Um, I would say if you can, try to find someone who you can speak German to. So that might be I haven't looked for this resource in a while, but I remember when I was learning Italian in college, um there were some websites where you could find someone who was learning English. I could find an Italian who was learning English, and I could do a little language exchange with them. So if there is any opportunities for that, whether it's virtual or whether it's in your city, to try to find somebody who is German who would be willing to speak in German with you, and maybe you would speak in English with them to help you both practice. So that wouldn't be, together with your son, but that might give you more confidence in developing your speaking skills. And another thing, this wouldn't be for speaking specifically, but I like to try to listen to podcasts when I'm learning a language. So there's a lot of language learning podcasts, or you can find one that's not for language learners and you can slow the speed down. So that might help expand your vocabulary. And another thing for adult language learners is I like to recommend keeping a journal, because writing is also a lot like speaking. You have to come up with the language output as opposed to listening and reading where you're taking in the input. So even if you just write a couple sentences every day, that will also help you um, get into the habit of language output in German.
Such amazing advice and things that I haven't even thought about, when it comes to languages. And I think that's a really important point about the output side of things. Like we are always taking things in and, listening and understanding and but we hardly ever output. And that output really, I guess it needs to happen so that you can solidify the learning or even practice what it is that you're bringing
Yeah.
in. So I
And
think that's
another
awesome.
great thing about the journal is that you can look back in, 2, 3, 4 months and see how much progress you've made. So I think it's also a great confidence boost.
Yeah, it really is. And like I learned French at school and I did that just during my primary school. So from, kindergarten, grade 1 to about year 6. And I continued when I came to Australia, but I mean I haven't spoken French for I don't know, a good 15, 20 years or something. And when I had gone to Lebanon, I don't speak Arabic, but a lot of the Lebanese speak French. So here I was pulling out French out of the bag, having conversations with people and listening. And I thought, oh my gosh, like it's all coming back, slowly. But
Yeah.
I think it's incredible how the brain retains, even though I haven't practiced at all, and just having that experience, I think really strengthened or having that output. So it's just fascinating.
Yeah.
So somebody on Facebook had this question. I'm bilingual and my daughter is with me most of the time. So I speak Spanish to her. We speak English as a family, but my materials books are mainly in English. Any tips for reading and learning to read for her? I'm assuming it would be in Spanish.
Yeah, that's a great question. So if, you know, if you have access to books in Spanish, the library is a great resource. I don't know where this person is located, but I don't know about most, many library systems do have books in foreign languages. And if they don't, you can often recommend that they purchase books. So
Yeah.
that's something to look into. If you're not finding what you want in your library's catalog, look on their website. There's often a form where you can request a book, or you can email a librarian or go speak to a librarian and ask how you can get more books in Spanish for children in your library's system. So that's a great place to start. And there are some websites that have free sourced books. They would be ebooks or PDFs. So you can look for those too. And I may be able to find a link to share. But otherwise, depending on your child's age, if they're, 1, 2, 3, I would say try translating your English books on the fly. Okay, 1 or 2. If they're a little older, 3, 4, 5, and they're starting to be interested in letters and reading, it really is beneficial for them to be able to see those words in Spanish as you read. It's okay still if you're translating them if they're English books, but as the child gets to be, pre-literate and then literate, we want them to be able to see those words as we're reading them. So for a 1 or 2-year-old who's maybe not going to be looking at the words so much as you're reading them, translate them on the fly, but really try to get books in another language, because that is such a great support for the child as they learn to read and write. Just even if they're not reading it, to see the words as you're reading them is
Mm.
really helpful. Yeah, but I think start with the library system. Go to your library and see what books they have available. It can be really challenging because they're I know in the United States we just don't have that many. I don't. It's just not as much a part of the culture to have multilingual materials. So I've heard this frustration a lot, but I think the more voices calling for multilingual books in library systems, for example, will hopefully bring about that change.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as society is changing, and as more people, it's becoming more multicultural, and people are wanting to explore more of that diversity and inclusion. I think that the more people that are interested in that, and the more that people are speaking about it and wanting it, the more that it's going to come up. Ayana was saying, I concur, Gabrielle. There are many emergent reader books in the dominant language and can be translated on the fly.
Yes. Hi, Ayana. Ayana and I did training together. She is a wonderful Montessorian and a children's librarian. So
Oh, lovely.
she
So
knows.
we'll
Yes.
definitely be contacting you for any for any books and resources that we need.
Yes.
Um, Talk to us, Gabrielle, about the Montessori side of things. So we've spoken a lot about language acquisition and bilingualism, and how the different approaches and things like that. From a Montessori perspective, what are some maybe activities or things that, or specific advice that you would give from a Montessori perspective, before we take this next question?
Yeah. So, one thing that parents might have heard is that in Montessori, we always say, follow the child. So, I think that's important to think about in language learning as well. And following the child's lead in what they're interested in, following the child's lead in their language development, and not, it's of course easy to say and hard to do, but to try to not get too stressed out about the timing of their progress. And as far as activities, so one thing that we do in the classroom when a child is really, say, a child is really only interested in cars and they don't want to do anything else but talk about cars. So then we find ways to apply their interest in cars to the areas of the classroom. Maybe we count cars. Maybe we write words about cars on the movable alphabet. So that's something that can be applied to language learning at home as well. You can learn vocabulary about all different kinds of cars. So that's, I think, another Montessori approach that parents can keep in mind when thinking about language learning. And then when thinking about activities, one thing that we do in the classroom that I like to recommend parents do at home is put labels on things. So if a child is not writing yet, a parent might write the labels for them, and then the child gets to go and stick them. So say you're labeling parts of the kitchen, things in the kitchen, the refrigerator and the chair and the table, and all of this is in the target language that you're trying to help your child learn. And then an older child can write the labels themselves, and then you might leave the labels up, and then you see them as you're walking by. And this is great also for parents who are learning a language with their child, to also see
Love
those
it.
labels up all the
I love
time.
it. I'm
Yeah.
going to go start labeling everything. So
Yeah,
good.
it's a great one. It's really fun. And then you can play a game where you collect the labels and, the child has to put them back on, and so
Oh,
there's a lot
that's
of,
so
yeah.
good. I love that.
And you can do that in all, you can do that with clothes in the closet. You can do it with parts of the house outside. You can do
Yeah,
it in all areas. So that's
I
really
love it.
fun.
Such a
And
great
then
tool.
another one is, there's, I think it's MontessoriDigital.org. It's an AMI resource, and they have classified cards
Yeah.
in many, many different languages. And they also have a place where I believe you can submit a language if a set has a language that you want them, that they don't have available to print.
Wow.
So a classified card set is a set of pictures. So say winter clothing, and for a child who's not reading yet, we introduce just the vocabulary for, say, it's 8 to 10 objects. So they learn snow boots, they learn coat, they learn hat,
Yeah.
scarf, gloves, etc. And this is an activity that we do in the classroom with a child's first language. And then when that child is reading, they would match the labels to the picture, and then they check their work with the card with the picture and the label. So when you're introducing a second or third language to your child, you can do this with the target language. So you
Mm.
might, and you can also do it the same set of pictures with multiple languages. So say you're doing one parent, one language, you can have the same set of pictures, and one parent can give the vocabulary in one language, one parent can give the vocabulary in another language. So that's a really great resource because they have so many languages. I think it's up to maybe 20 languages that they offer. And if a specific set doesn't have the language you want, you can submit it, and then they'll produce a PDF of it, and then you can print it.
Gabrielle, do you have the link for that resource? I was just, somebody was asking, and I know I'm going to pop this up here while you do that. Ayana gave us the childrenslibrary.org resource, and she's also posted another one. So this is for everyone listening on YouTube, because you wouldn't have gotten this link. There's also this one here up on the screen, and I'm going to post another one just now so you guys can copy it over. These are some amazing library resources that you guys can find some resources for your language journey. And I'll just leave that up for one more minute. And then we've got two more questions that I will. Okay, there's three more. I am mindful of time, but Samantha was saying awesome resources. Thank you. Yes, I'm super excited. Thanks, Ayana and Gabrielle, for these. I know that everyone loves some really great resources.
Yeah. So the one I was talking about with the classified cards is MontessoriDigital.org.
Okay. I'll see if I can, while you answer the next question, I'll see if I can get the link and pop it in the comments. Okay. We have a question. Yetzi was saying, I'm watching you ladies from Canada, another country I really want to visit. I'm bilingual. I speak English and Spanish. Dad speaks English. Should we use the Opal method, or what do you recommend? Also, I got some books that mention things and places in both Spanish and English. Should I use those or stay with one language each parent?
Okay, great questions. So I would say to the extent that you're comfortable, try to speak in Spanish to your child as much as you can. If dad speaks a little Spanish, he can try to speak in Spanish when you're together as a family. If not, that's fine too. You can speak in English as a family. But I would say when you can, to try to prioritize speaking in Spanish, and maybe only speak in Spanish when you're alone with your child, and maybe together you speak English as a family, because Spanish in this case is the language that won't get as much support from the wider community. And as far as books, dual language books are great, especially, you can also use them a little bit like we talked about the Spanish, not the Spanish, the sandwich method. So if you're reading the book in Spanish, you might be reading it in Spanish and only read the word in English. That's a new word. So you don't necessarily have to read both things in English and in Spanish. Or you can read the book only in Spanish, and then dad could read the book only in English. So I like to use dual language books, not necessarily reading all the words in both languages, especially if one language is stronger than the other, than to support that language that isn't getting as much input.
Thanks for answering that one. I'm going to race through the next two questions. So one says, Spanish is my native language and my husband's is Finnish. We live in a Spanish-speaking country. However, since English is our common language, we always speak English at home. My husband speaks Finnish to our 2-year-old daughter, and she knows some Spanish words, or she hears it from relatives. Should I start speaking Spanish to her? I'm scared about confusing her.
Yes, do it. Yes, I think so. I don't think that she'll be confused. 2 years old is perfect. It's really the perfect age to start doing this. So in this scenario, you might use the one parent, one language method, and you would speak in Spanish to her when it's just you, and your husband would speak in Finnish to her, and then you can speak in English to each other, and she'll learn English in that context as well. So I think that it's a great time, great opportunity to start speaking in Spanish to her as well.
Thanks for the encouragement, Gabrielle. I think everyone needs to hear it. Another Facebook user, when should I start speaking to my child in the second language? From birth? I'm also the only bilingual parent. Should I use the Opal method? Her father works away from home for a week. So should I mostly speak in that second language while he's away, or all the time when I'm with her?
great question. So yes, from birth, that if you can do it, if you have a child who's older than an infant, that's okay, but the sooner the better, definitely. And yes, I think if you are comfortable speaking in the second language all the time when you're with her, do it. Especially if it sounds like her father's language is the majority language of the community. If that's the case, she'll get that input. Um, and I said this a little earlier, but it doesn't have to be equal input when children are really young. And I think that's important too. So if a child, it's okay to prioritize the minority language before a child goes to school. And maybe they're not fluent in the majority language when they start school, but they'll learn it very quickly. So a lot of families choose to kind of front load that minority language. So in this case, you might choose to only speak in the second language when you're alone with her, and then when you're together, you can use your family language, which might be the community language. And I think that's a great way to give her more second language or it wouldn't be her second language, more of the minority language input.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you mentioned about that 30%, that's a really great statistic to make sure you've got that 30% input wherever it is. That would help everybody to understand like how much they should do or how little. But I really feel like it's never too much. Am
Yeah.
I right? Or is that just me?
Yeah. I mean, you really need to think about supporting the minority language or languages, and it is never too much. When I say 30%, I almost want to say don't worry about the majority language at all, because children will pick up the community language. They will start
Yeah.
school, they will learn that language. They've been hearing it outside, even if you don't speak it as a family. So, really think about prioritizing the minority language, even if that means 90% of the child's life for the first 4 years, they're hearing the minority language. That's wonderful, because it
Yeah,
won't always, that ratio won't always be that way. So,
of course.
yes, as far as minority language input, it's never too much.
Okay, we're going to take one last question here. My daughter is 1 year old, and I'm guilty of mixing English and Spanish within the same sentence. We speak English as a family, but I'm trying to teach Spanish. What's the best way to go about this? I'm the primary Spanish speaker to her, but English is still my strong suit.
I would say don't feel pressure to only speak Spanish to her all the time. It's definitely okay to speak in English to her, to be a parent who speaks English and Spanish. I would say the timer method, whether it's a timer on your phone or a sand timer, to try to for yourself give some structure to that. So say for 5 minutes, I'm going to try to not use any English words. And then maybe you make that a little longer, and maybe it's a half hour, and maybe it's an hour, to give yourself some structure and to take some of that pressure off of trying to only speak in Spanish when English is your strong suit. And then you might find that you are becoming more comfortable in Spanish the more you use it. It's like a muscle that, using a language and speaking a language is a muscle that we have to exercise. So don't be too hard on yourself if it's something you haven't exercised in a while.
Yeah, absolutely. I will just want to take this last one because we haven't really touched on this topic, and we've got 1 minute, so we'll quickly address it if we can. My son, who has Down syndrome, understands French, English, and Spanish, but has speech delay. He's 4.5. What is your input about focusing on only one language?
So I think they're asking, do you think they're asking, should they only focus on one language?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I think continue to offer multiple languages. I don't know too much about Down syndrome specifically as it relates to language learning, but I do know that even in children with language delays or learning differences, that they are still capable of multilingualism, when we should still offer them multilingualism. And I think that it's really beneficial for your son to continue hearing these three languages. And there's probably a lot that we don't know about the benefits of multilingualism as it relates to brain development. So, maybe scientists will find that children with Down syndrome who are multilingual, have they're able to learn language faster. Who knows? But I think it's wonderful to continue speaking those three languages.
Gabrielle, honestly, thank you so much. And I know Ayana and myself have posted the MontessoriDigital.org websites and things for the digital resources that you were mentioning. So thank you so much
Awesome.
for that. I personally have learnt so much from this session, and I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation with you. And I know the thank yous are going to be pouring in. Can you tell us more, just quickly in the last 30 seconds, tell us where people can find more information about you? Feel free to pop your links in the comments so that people can know where to find more information if they want to connect with you. Listen to the podcast, because I will be on the podcast
Yes.
in March. So let us know where can people find you from?
Yes. I'm not sure if I can pop my links in the comments,
Okay.
but on Instagram, I'm multilingual.montessori. My website is multilingualmontessori.org. And the podcast, you can find it on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify. Look for Multilingual Montessori, and you'll find all the episodes there. I have a lot of resources on my website, and Instagram's the social media that I use the most. So please reach out there. I'd love to continue the conversation.
Yes, absolutely. And what I'll do is after the broadcast, you can just jump on Facebook on the live. You'll see it in our group and on YouTube, and you can just pop your. We'll definitely make sure to pop your socials and links in there so everybody else can find about you. And Yetzi, we will share the resource link again once we jump off the live. I'll make sure to pop them all into the comments. Thank you so much, Gabrielle. It's been absolutely amazing having you here. Thanks for joining us at Guide and Grow. Community support. This is what it's all about, connecting with others, in areas that you're passionate about and we're passionate about. So thank you so much for your expertise. And everybody, make sure you check out Multilingual Montessori. That's what Gabrielle's all about. And thank you once again for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. This was so much fun. I hope it was helpful for everyone. Thank you for joining us.
All right. Take care, everyone.